There are certainly households and businesses that, paying more for their heating and cooling is not going to be a burden, right? But that's not true for every household and every business. And so we really need to think about how to mitigate that. And so I'm not sure if Seth mentioned there's some interest in, carbon funds where people could swap so that there might be ways to mitigate those those new expenses that hit certain categories of people. But I think the real thing is that, the reason that natural gas is less expensive is primarily because a lot of the burdens of natural gas are being borne by the population, and so they're not being priced in, right? And so we really want to see our city move towards using electricity more and more for both buildings and for transportation, because we know the grid is going to get cleaner and cleaner as more renewable energy comes on. So it's really the most elegant way for everyone to be more renewable is if more people are using electricity.
99416, meaning that's about 600 kilowatt hours below zero. So since the system got turned on, which I think was last October, I'm now 400 kilowatt hours to the good. So the property here is undeveloped, so I had basically a blank slate, and the fact that the house or potential house would be in the middle of a field, I had perfect solar capabilities. When I talked to Revision Energy, they came and they measured and they said, oh, you're 90-some% efficient for solar panels. And I sort of have a belief that everything is moving generally towards a net zero. So I said, hey, I'm going to give that a try. But I was a little hesitant because I didn't know exactly what I was getting into. So I told the architect, hey, let's get close, but let's not sort of go overboard on it, because I didn't know really what the cost was. I didn't really know exactly. I'm not sure I used the word net zero with him, but energy efficient. But the more I got into it, I said, well, heck, well let's try for net zero and just see what happens. Yeah, so there's a number of different definitions, but most of the sort of consensus definition would be if you have a net zero house, you're generating as much renewable energy as the house uses, but it's measured on an annual basis, and most all net zero houses are connected into the electric grid.
Like Mason's, the home you were able to view is alleged to be. I'm pretty sure it is, but I don't know if they've proofed it yet. Maybe they have by now. But so yeah, I've gotten to be involved, in quite a few efficiency homes, in the past few decades. So a net zero house is a house that is deemed by the industry and by me to be completely off of the grid as far as its energy use. It can be dependent on the grid from time to time.
Yeah, it's quite unusual for a net zero house to be off grid. Like I say, you run into all the problems of you're going to have to store your excess energy, and that's quite expensive with the current battery technology. So the general strategy on net zero is to first site your house to take advantage of solar. So this house is rectangular with the long side of the rectangle facing southerly. You always have constraints because like here, the view is like down the field, so the house really sort of wants to face this way, but your access is over here, and your garage is, you got to be there. So you got to think about, it's more than just the sunshine, but a lot of to get to net zero, the first thing you want to try to do is position the house to get as much sunshine as you did. So here we're about 10 degrees off of due south. So for net zero, the first thing to do is to try to orient your house properly, get as much natural sunlight and energy, if you will, in a northern climate. That's what you want to do. And then you want to cut way down on your energy demand. About 60% of your energy demand in this geography has to do with heating. And so you want to insulate heavily, and you want to reduce your electric loads. And so you reduce your electric loads by using like Energy Star appliances, LED lighting.
I think as we learn more and more about the kind of clean energy transition as a whole, we really learn more about how it in order for it to be successful, it really needs to include all members of society. I think this is the principle behind the Green New Deal, right? Is that we can make the transition not only to avoid the climate change impacts that we're concerned about, but also to really create more economic opportunity for all of our citizens. So in Cambridge, individual citizens can petition the city to make changes to the zoning, which controls the development patterns in Cambridge. And so in 2013, citizens petitioned to require new buildings to achieve net zero emissions, considering that Cambridge had very ambitious climate goals, but we're also was just starting up the current development boom, and it's like, well, how are we going to get to our climate goals if we're building these huge buildings that are using a lot of energy and emissions? So the petition requested that the city consider requiring those new buildings to achieve net zero emissions immediately. Yeah. So first, it's important to clarify the definition of net zero in Cambridge. So we use a net zero emissions definition, which is different than a net zero energy definition. So whereas net zero energy requires a building to produce all of its energy needs on site, net zero emissions allows the building to bring in renewable energy to offset the energy that is consumed within that building framework. So Cambridge, along with Boston and 14 other communities in Metro Boston, all are part of what's called the Metro Mayors Compact. And that compact was organized by the Metropolitan Area Planning Council, which is the regional planning agency in Greater Boston. And so the 16 mayors and city managers of those communities have all committed in the concept of environmental justice and environmental equity in our climate and energy programs. We see the impacts of climate change certainly being society-wide, and the need to mitigate those impacts for all of our residents, and particularly lower income or other socially vulnerable residents, because they're likely to bear the brunts of those impacts more than others. So we're really trying to think about ways to include that. Just another example is that we have it's called Community Aggregation Program to bring more renewable energy to our residents through their electricity purchases. And as part of that program, we're collecting a little bit of money from every resident to build a community solar project in Cambridge that all of those residents would benefit from the renewable energy from that project.
I talked to an affordable housing developer who's actually going to be speaking on a webinar of ours next month, and who built a 60-unit building in Maine, and he said that the annual cost per apartment for heating and cooling is $25 in Maine. Which is like, because sometimes people are like, well, that's California. And I'm like, no, this is Maine, right? Where it's hot during the summer and it's cold during the winter. And so I think that, there are models for ways to do affordable housing better that Massachusetts can learn from. And, the nice thing about somebody else doing it first is that you can do it much faster then. And so we have a big focus on buildings because that's something where we felt like our community-led model can really make a difference. And we are working to try to get a net zero stretch code passed, which would mean that buildings in certain communities could pass a net zero stretch code, which would mean all their new buildings could be net zero, and then all their existing buildings could eventually be retrofitted, which would help them get to that zero goal. there are communities where most of the buildings can actually have enough solar to supply their energy, for instance, on the roof of the building. But in a place like Boston, you've got high rises. And so a high rise can't actually, on their little teeny roof for all those floors, they can't actually produce enough clean energy. So what we encourage communities to think about is how can you produce as much as you can on site, have your use be as minimal as possible, right? So you get the most efficient building to start with, and then have the rest of it be clean from somewhere close by. You start out with the legislation, and then you start thinking about the regulation, which is the implementation. What does it actually look like to make this a reality? And what we would like to see for the implementation for that regulation piece is to really prioritize the folks who can least afford large energy bills, right? So think about how we can prioritize affordable housing, for instance. And I think technology changes, right? So like what we're building today, we may find some wonderful new technology, whether it's solar that works better in low light conditions, or some sort of fabulous thing that we can put in the walls that makes our buildings much more efficient. We will find things along the way that will make our buildings better. So we wanted to leave some flexibility for folks to do that. As the technologies improve, we didn't want to lock them into today's technologies for buildings of the future.
Yeah, I mean, I think that when you're looking at balancing upfront cost, operational cost, and then also our kind of community, city and state commitments to carbon reduction, it's something that we really need to be implementing on all of our buildings. For us, we see in housing, we see a market for it in custom single family residential work, and we see housing authorities and affordable housing developers who are really following this, the sort of passive house methodology. The ones to lag right now, I think, are probably more of the market rate developers. But my hope is that with increasing codes and also additional incentives, as well as the power of local communities, often through zoning board and through special permits, to suggest or require higher levels of energy performance that go beyond the code, that's what's going to push kind of the middle of the market rate projects into this realm of net zero and passive. Sometimes the site doesn't lend itself to using on-site renewables to reach zero or to reach net positive, but the sort of process that we go through of focusing on design, of working with a client to right-size the home, then focusing on the enclosure, the design of the walls and the specifications on the windows, in order to really reduce the need to heat and cool the home. And then finally, focusing on efficient systems inside for heating and cooling, for domestic hot water, and then offsetting that really reduced energy use with renewable energy. Oftentimes a rooftop solar or PV array is kind of a strategy that works on every project.
We have to look at everything. There's a large code book that we need to make sure that we comply with. There's zoning codes, there's building codes, energy codes. So there's a lot to start just to get you the basics. Massachusetts has what they call a stretch code, which goes a little beyond the code requirements currently in force, and some communities have adopted that, some haven't. But eventually the codes catch up. So you're always trying to stay a little bit ahead of that if you want to do as best we can. There's a lot of teamwork as well between energy efficiency consultants or materials suppliers and also the builders as well. It's a much more integrated design team to get to net zero or passive house standards. They have to work together, make sure everybody understands the goals and is on board to going that little bit further. Also, just how these products work, because they're a little different than the way things worked in the past. All the joints are sealed much more thoroughly. The windows are really sealed into the envelope in a different way. So we really need to get the window manufacturer at the table with the builder, with the architect, to make sure that when we put this together, we're going to put it together right and efficiently.
So the most costly piece would definitely be the solar piece, if you look at it pre-tax and pre-incentive, meaning that if the homeowner chooses to own their solar system, they're going to have a fairly big upfront cost. Now that's going to get mitigated through the tax rebates and some of the other incentive programs. But if you're going to have an alternative energy source, somebody's going to have to pay for the solar system. So, I've added up, my incremental costs and stuff. But again, it's sort of tough. But this house probably, when I add it all together, it's probably the net zero piece of it, depending on what you really call part of the net zero, probably adds about 10% to the value or the cost. Right. So I didn't have a controlled, budget like that, and the cost also, of course, is somewhat of a function of the size. For a $250,000 house, I suspect it's maybe smaller than this, and so your numbers, ratchet down. This solar system is, quite large. Someone else could build a smaller house and put in half the number of panels in their solar system would be, less. So their cost to get to net zero pre-tax, pre-incentive would be a lot less than mine.
I think it's easy to focus on your utility bill, and it's sort of the tragedy of the commons when it comes to things like natural gas, right? Because when you have natural gas that's being fracked in Pennsylvania, there are people in those communities that are bearing the brunt of, dirtier water and the direct air pollution of the fracking sites. And so, we're really just sort of exporting the costs of inexpensive energy. And I think that that's also something that we really need to keep in mind when we're thinking about what's best for the community, is to not just think about what's best for people in the Cambridge community. Obviously, we want to do our best for them, but also what's best for the community in Pennsylvania and what's best for the global community. And so, we really need to start thinking about how we can stop outsourcing those burdens, and that might mean that we have to pay more for some of the things that we use, but that's really, we're just paying the sort of the fair price so that someone else isn't living with asthma or dirty water right next to a fossil fuel extraction site.
We'll let you talk in 1 second. I told everybody in my office there would be two things that would definitely come up in this conversation. One would be cost, and the second would be regulatory red tape. And so I'm very conscious of both. And our consultants are going to deal with the cost issue, and I'm personally committed to sort of trying to deal with the regulatory part, and not making it not cumbersome, like our status quo kind of cumbersome process. So that answer that question.
I think part of the thing about bringing in the for-profit developers and the for-profit builders.
Just jump in. I'll just jump. So Meredith Albaum, USGBC, Massachusetts. We have a report coming out probably in the next couple of weeks. We're rolling it out in July on the cost of zero energy buildings. And everything that we have in this report corresponds with what they're saying here, which is that the cost does not have, to get to zero with you're always going to pay more to have the renewables on the building, but to get to the to these levels, to get to the zero energy ready, we're calling it, corresponds exactly with what they're saying right here, which is that
to code compliance.
Yes.
In what state?
Compared to a baseline in Massachusetts. In Massachusetts, here to get to a baseline, and I mean he keeps on saying it over and over. Look at that 23% glazing. It's about the design. You decide at the beginning of the project that this is what you want to do. You get and we start training up every time. When people do this the first time, it typically costs more money, is what we're finding. But once they figure out how to do it, I mean, look at the projects. I mean, I'm pointing at Placeteller, but the project they're doing, they're showing over and over and over and again that it's about design and thinking differently about these projects. You can't just take a project that you're going to build, that we're building as is today and say, oh, we're going to do this, but it's from day one saying we're going to go into this. And we're finding over and over, even outside of this market, but across building types, that it can be done. And that it can be done. It's thinking slightly differently. So not having a glass stairwell, and if you want to have that pretty glass stairwell, well then you're going to pay more money for that, and that you balance it out.
To that point, these two buildings house the exact same number of people. So the question is, do you want to give people, design whichever one you want, or do you want to, nudge them towards this?
It's a trade-off too, where you go with the added. I mean, our numbers are not showing the airtightness at that level, but you get to that airtightness, and your systems are getting smaller. All right, and so you have to make sure that you have the designers you're working with who are going to say, yes, we actually are going to hit those targets, and so we're actually believe we're going to do this, and we can make our systems smaller and spend less money there. So it's a balance between the two. I absolutely, like we're saying, I'm wondering about a couple other thoughts. I've been sitting here with, I keep raising my hand and not saying anything, but to the point about on-site verification, wondering about retro commissioning and figuring that into this. I mean, different building type, MLK School in Cambridge saw a 30% reduction in their energy use from 30-something to 24-something kB2 per square foot per year with commissioning over the 3 years that it's been open. I mean, so, the energy modeling, you were asking, energy models don't predict the results. Absolutely, they're not accurate. The energy models are meant as a design tool to say this is going to make this much of a difference, this is going to make this much of a difference. When you look at building the energy model, when you look at all the architects, very rarely does the energy model predict what's actually happening in the building. But if you go back and retro commission and try to get the energy model to match and understand what's going on, then you get to those targets. So it's a couple things. So I mean, cost, absolutely, but we can do it. We just have to get it in the RFPs in the beginning and say, let's go. And you challenge the design teams, they love this challenge. They want to do it. They just have to be told, well, let's do it. And then on a completely side note, making the connection to health, like we've been talking about, we're talking about affordable housing, right? And so we just had a summit with Dr. Joe Allen from Harvard. Have any of you heard him speak? He's making the connection between cognitive effects and indoor air quality. And he is actually quantifying in dollars the amount of money we can save in healthcare related to having healthier buildings. And if we're building buildings to this air tightness, we're bringing in higher quality fresh air. And we can actually, there's this could we in Boston take this to the next level in terms of connecting, getting dollars from healthcare providers or from insurance companies related to this, because we're building these healthier buildings. Off topic, but related in terms of money and the money story, because what Dr. Allen says is the people who design our buildings and operate them have more impact on our health than our doctors, because we spend 90% of our time inside buildings. And so if we can build these healthier buildings, we should see public health improve.
We're a small city. It's 6 square miles. It's not all that renewable energy is not going to happen in this city, and so it's also about things like creating community solar projects that might not be within the bounds of the city but are still available for residents and businesses to take advantage of that solar. And then of course there's the political momentum that needs to happen at the State House, where we really the easiest solar or the easiest wind power to do is these utility scale projects, right? You get this economy of scale. And so, Cambridge and the residents and businesses that live in Cambridge and Boston, need to be advocating at the statewide level to continue to push for more and more renewables to be brought onto our grid over the next couple decades, so that if you don't have solar on your roof, your power is still getting cleaner just from the actions of the utility companies aligning with state regulations. So it really is sort of all those levels, on your building, out, doing community-based solar, maybe outside the city, and then doing much larger renewable energy projects on a utility scale around the region.
The way I see it, the wealthy can afford it around here, and no one else seems to be doing it, There needs to be more incentives. Mm-hmm. They need to be more commensurate with the true cost to do it, and they need to be clear. Like, go try to figure out if you want to have an exercise in futility, go try to figure out what Mason's incentives are and how they've changed and what they really are, because, you need a PhD. I mean, it's crazy. It's crazy. Wind farms, hydro farms, and off-site solar. That's the only way they're going to be able to do it. You try to get those blue bloods to open their wallets and rip their homes apart, you'll have another Tea Party revolution.